thanks for coming on this talk. What I wanted to talk about today was one of the oldest problems in information and IT security, and potentially a new way that we can solve it using upcoming open source software. So before I get started, very quick about me, why am I giving this talk? So I've been in information and IT security for a while now. I realized when I was writing this slide, the fact that I even call it information and IT security pretty much flags my age, what gets called cybersecurity these days. I worked in a number of organizations, financial services, consultancy, and as a long time as a pen tester. So I did a lot of web application security testing, a lot of Kubernetes container testing, and a lot of cloud native system testing. These days, I'm a senior security advocate at Datadog, where I focus on containerization and cloud native. And I've done quite a few things around the kind of containerization security, cloud native space, working with CNCF tag security and Kubernetes security. So, but let's get on with the talk. So what I want to talk about, this is what I call problem zero in security. So before you want to apply controls to a system, before you threat model your environment, before you write policies to say what you want to do, what controls you want, what risks do you have to know what you've got. You have to have some idea of the systems you've got, the services you've got, and also you've got to know how they work. Because if you don't know how they work, you're going to apply the wrong controls, and if you don't know what you've got, you're going to put your effort in the wrong places. You're not going to apply your resources, limited as they always are for security, in the right place. So this is a problem that is not new. This has been around in security for a long time. Definitely all the time I've been in information IT security, knowing what we've got has been something that's been a challenge and something we needed to work on. So there are essentially, like most things in security, there are two different challenges, or two different sets of challenges that we need to think about. First one is technical challenges. I need to work out exactly what I've got. Well, how do I do that? I might deploy agents onto every single system so that they can record what's going on there. I might want to also do things like, for example, log into all my services. I've got a series of technical challenges. We'll talk about those. But the other ones we've got to take account of is the organizational challenges. It's not just about technical. It's never about technical insecurity just. It's about organizational challenges. Security departments are one part of an organization. They don't have the authority, perhaps they never had. Maybe in very old days in some banks you could just go in and say, we will do X. You have to work with different teams to say, hey, we need to understand what you're doing, how it's working, how can we do that? And that can present challenges and things that are going to cause you problems. So, like I said, this has always been a problem. I mean, it was mentioned actually by Hannah in the panel before about the old days of enterprise IT. Things used to happen a bit more slowly. You would have change meetings once a week or maybe even once a month. You would have a new product going in. It may take months or even years for a project to come in. Now, we have a world where ephemeral systems come and go immediately. I have new container releases to a cluster every minute. Trying to track what's going on there is obviously more difficult. I've got a fast-moving world. I've got something which changes all the time. And I also don't necessarily know what, for example, container works with what application. So a container issues a log error message saying, hey, something bad happened on a node in a cluster. What business unit did that container belong to? What application did that container belong to? That's no longer an easy question. I can't just dump the logs off the host and say, oh, it's obviously this team because that's their VM. No, that isn't their VM because they don't even know where their application is deployed to. They gave it to an SRE team who put it on a cluster somewhere. Discoverability in cloud native world, knowing what you've got and how it works, is, I think, a much bigger challenge than it used to be. And we've got lots and lots of information to deal with. Before we were pulling logs off applications and virtual machines, back in the day, now we've got cloud service provider logs. We have got container orchestration logs. We have got container logs. We have got application library inventories for all the third-party software we've got. And we've got the application code itself. So we've got a huge number of sources of information that we're trying to manage, alongside of the fact that it's all changing really, really quickly. These are obviously challenges that security teams are grappling with. How do I actually handle this? Because I've got this fire hose of information coming at me. And then, alongside of those technical challenges, we have our organizational challenges. We are going to have to persuade teams to take time out of their busy schedule to deploy our software into their environments. They've got a lot on their own plates. That might not be something they have time for. If you have a problem in an environment and a security agent's been deployed with it, I've had the experience of everyone saying, well, it must be the security thing because we just deployed that and it does weird things that we don't understand. So we'll turn that off, right? Well, in the old days, it was, we'll turn our antivirus off. Something broke on the server, turn the antivirus off, was the first reaction because it was obviously causing problems. So there are organizational challenges there, but there are also organizational challenges where if you have your own tooling, security teams deal with one set of tooling, operational teams deal with a different set, you have two different views of the world. And when the security teams say, hey, we're seeing this, we think you've got this deployed, the ops team go, no, we don't, we've got something else deployed, because our sources of information are different than yours. They refresh at a different rate, they're installed in different ways, and you have this problem of siloing. Security teams are often siloed off from operational teams, and you have then an issue of, like, how do I actually talk to them? How do I make sure we're working off the same kind of information? So this is kind of laying out a problem I think exists and is kind of magnifying over time. How do I think we can address this? Because I wouldn't just want to come up here and say, hey, it's a horrible problem, and step off stage. That's no use. So what I wanted to talk about was the rise of observability. This is a kind of discipline within IT which is seeing an increase in prominence. As a good example of this, you can notice that there is at KubeCon this year, there's an observability day. So there's a dedicated day to observability. This is something that IT teams are talking about and they're thinking about. And what they're thinking about is how can we essentially set our services and applications up in a way that is observable. But if I'm going to describe that, I probably need to get past the buzzword, because that's one word, observability. What does that actually mean? So I did what every good person would do in researching a talk, and I went on the internet and found a definition. Not Wikipedia, which you would usually expect. This one comes from the OpenTelemetry website. And they say observability lets us understand a system from the outside by letting us ask questions about that system without knowing its inner workings. Furthermore, it allows us to easily troubleshoot and handle novel problems, i.e. unknowns, and helps us answer the question, why is this happening? When I read that as a security person, I thought, wow, that's exactly what I want to know. Because security teams often sit outside of the production systems. They're not necessarily having access. So we are sitting outside. But we want to know the inner workings. We want to know what's going on, because that's going to help us determine where the risks are, determine where the vulnerabilities are, so that we can fix them. And also, well, what do we do apart from solve unknown unknowns? Because attackers are known for changing up what they do, for finding new and different ways of attacking systems. So we are very, very commonly trying to answer unknown questions. So this, as it stands, this sounds absolutely perfect. I would like this, please, because this is going to make my security life considerably easier. So at a high level, that's great. But how does it actually work? So how do you do observability? And this one, I will say, from all the reading I've done so far on this topic, is not, I don't think this is a 100% settled definition, but this is a general way of thinking about observability. So we essentially have three pillars of observability. We have logs, right? Log information is generated by applications and services. Anyone who's ever used any application or operating system, you've used journal.ctl inside a Linux host, you've looked at application logs in Windows, you've looked at them wherever you're doing. That obviously makes sense, and we can understand that that's going to have a lot of information we want. Then we also have metrics. So the second pillar of observability is metrics. Anything you can represent as a numeric value on a system that changes over time. So that could be something like CPU usage, it could be memory, network bandwidth, it could be something like how many users are logged into a system, how deep is a queue. Anything you can generate, add a number to it and then put it in a time series database can be a metric. These two, fairly understandable. If you've used System Monitor or any operating system and said, why is my system running slowly, you've used a metric, right? You've looked at CPU usage over time. Kind of makes sense. And the third one is tracing. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But I do want to say one other thing about observability is it's not just a question of taking these fire hoses of data from all our cloud-native systems, chucking them into a database and saying, great, I'm observable. That's not it. That's not observability. You have to also add a lot of metadata to all of this information to allow you to correlate it. So if you think about a cloud-native system, I've got, say, 50 containers running across 30 different hosts. I need to say this container belong to that application which belongs to this team, so that if there's a production issue, I know who to send the that for. So a lot of it is adding good metadata and good tags to all of this vast amount of information. And you can see from a security perspective, it would be similar. We want to add good tagging so we can say this is an application, for example, that's exposed to the internet. That's a very useful tag to have. Because then if I see some sort of increase in error rate, I can go, well, that might be a bit of a risk because that's exposed to an untrusted network. So adding good metadata is kind of important as well. The reason I wanted to break out tracing from the other two is because I kind of think that logging and metrics are things that are fairly, anyone who's used computer systems has used logs and metrics. You may not have used distributed tracing. So this is something which gets heavily used in microservices applications. So if you're doing a lot of cloud native, you're probably using microservices. And one of the big problems with microservices is I've got all these different discrete blobs of code that run potentially in different containers on different hosts and different networks. If a user does a transaction and it goes through 10 different microservices and one of the containers or the applications fails, how do I know what transaction that related to? So with tracing, what you do is add information to your code that allows you to track the execution of an individual user's request through all these different microservices and say all these different parts, all these different sets of information related to this one transaction. Very, very useful if you are trying to track what's going on in an app. And it looks a bit like this. This comes from the OTel demo application, and you can kind of see how it works. For this view, this is obviously a performance-based view, but you can see what someone was trying to do there. They were checking out of an e-commerce basket, and it went through a number of different microservices. But being able to track that through is very useful. And also, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, as an application security person, that's a really interesting view as well. Because if I'm trying to secure an application, for example, I'm trying to threat model it, knowing what microservices were involved in a given transaction is very information to me. So, with all of this, it kind of leads me on to OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry is an interesting project. It's relatively new. It only started in 2019. And it was a merger of two existing open source projects, OpenCensus and OpenTracing. And the idea of OpenTelemetry is to provide a vendor-neutral API and SDK for observability. So obviously, if we can provide an open source SDK, it's easier for people to adopt it. It's easier for open source projects to adopt it. They can embed it inside the project. It can be part of more and more applications, which gives us more and more information. And I think with OpenTelemetry, this is something that we'll see growing. And I've got a couple of examples why I think it will grow. This is the CNCF. They have a survey they do of all their projects and say which of these are the most active. And you can see, obviously, Kubernetes, unsurprisingly, the CNCF is number 1, but OpenTelemetry is number 2. So OpenTelemetry is the second most active project currently in CNCF over the last year, which says there's a lot of people looking at this and a lot of people putting effort into this. Also, we've got something where, for example, Gartner are saying that they expect 70% of applications in 2025 to be instrumented with OpenTelemetry. So they're seeing a likelihood that OpenTelemetry will be embedded inside far more applications. Another example of this from the container land is I've been looking a bit, obviously, I've done a lot of work with containerization, and what I've noticed is that all the components of container stacks are now being instrumented by OTel by default. So Kubernetes, Docker, Containerd, these can all be configured with command line flags now to emit tracing data. So you can get tracing data out of not just the code you write, but out of the code that supports it, the code that runs your environments. So there's a lot of opportunity there to say this is something, I think anyway, that's going to take off. So using observability tooling for security. So at the start of this, I was trying to set up this idea that the problem or the risk that we have is that we can't keep up. Security tools can't keep up. They're not able to essentially keep up to date with what's going on. What do we have in our environments? How does it work? If we start using observability tooling, there's potentially several large benefits to us as security teams. There's the technical benefit of if the application is instrumented with observability and we can just pull information from that instrumentation, we have less of a need to do things like deploy agents. That's going to make it easy for us to get access to the information. Also, this instrumentation is already in there. It's already in place. So we can say, well, we can have a feed of the thing you've already got, and we can work off of that. It also gets you away from the siloing problem. So the idea of business silos where we're working off different information and the risks that that poses, you can get away from that if you start using observability tooling for security. So I think there's a number of technical and also organizational benefits to this idea, and it's something that I think we can work more on. As one example, I just kind of give one example of what's there now. This again is the OpenTel demo application. And this is an architecture diagram that it creates automatically. And it creates it automatically based off real application data. So this isn't a static diagram that an architect has drawn up and said, this is how I think it will work. This is really how these microservices work. Now, if you imagine yourself as being a security analyst and you have been tasked to help threat model an existing application, and you can get that, that's great. That's really, really, really useful. because it tells me what microservices talk to what other microservices. So when I'm thinking about authentication or authorization controls, I know where to go and look at them. It tells me, from a network perspective, again, which ones need to talk to other ones. So if I want to lock things down at a network level, I have an architecture model that I can use and have some confidence that the controls I put in place aren't going to break the application, because I'm looking at real traffic. I'm not looking at a diagram that might be out of date that was drawn up like 6-9 months ago. So I think that's one example of where it's already useful. Another example, and this is kind of one that's kind of near and dear to my own heart, is I spent many years as a web application pen tester. And in the UK, it's not the case in every country, but in the UK, web application pen testing, I always liken it to the idea that you're sticking sharp sticks into closed boxes and hoping you hit something and then trying to work out whether what you hit is relevant for security. So you get your SQL injection vector, your cross-site scripting vector, or whatever, and you poke it into the closed box that is the application, and you look for error messages or timeouts, or if you're really unlucky, the entire application crashes and someone starts calling you and saying, why is my website broken? But it's not a very efficient way of testing. However, that is how a huge, probably the majority of web application tests get done these days. As a web application tester, I'm looking at OpenTelemetry, and I'm looking at observability tooling, and thinking this would have been absolutely fantastic for me to be able to do a better job at what I was doing, because I could see when I put my vector in where it went. I could tell you which microservice had an error, and I could give the developer back a useful bug to actually say, hey, it's this microservice, it errored out here when I put this vector in. And that gives them a much easier job to create test cases to actually fix the problems. And also, as a pen tester, I never got, or very rarely got, live production access. People don't like giving pen testers live production access to their systems for some reason. So we sit outside, and I come back to that OpenTelemetry definition that says you're sitting outside the system. Well, that's exactly what a lot of pen testers do. They have to sit outside the system and kind of poke it from the outside. Having observability tooling, having access to that, could be really, really useful for security. So, challenges in using observability tools. I would love to stand up here and tell you it's all sweetness and light. You just go and you just take all your security tooling, get rid of that, and put observability tooling in, and it'll work. And that, I would be remiss if I said that. There are some challenges. The first one is that the way these tools are designed at the moment is for their existing use case. So they're designed for problem solving, they're designed for performance monitoring. And as a result, the information they gather might not be gathered in a way that works for security. So with logs, for example, for operational problems, you might only want to store a log for a day or a week, maybe a month. For security, you might need to go back 6-9 months to work out what happened in an incident. So you're going to have to speak to the teams and say, where do the logs go? Are they put into cold storage after a while? How do I rehydrate the logs to get them back if I need to go back further? You do need to speak to them about that. With metrics, again, after a while, people will tend to aggregate metrics. So they'll just store an average for a day instead of storing like far more fine-grained. As a security person, we might need to know exactly when was that CPU spike start, because that's when the crypto mining happened and when we were getting hit by something. So you do have to work out whether that's going to be there. And for tracing, the thing that reduces its usefulness as it stands at the moment is typically tracing is sampled. So when you're tracing, you won't take every single trace that goes through the system because of the volume of data, and especially if you're using SaaS platforms, or indeed any platform, the more you store, the more it costs, right? The more processing time you have, the more disk space you have to use, the more it costs, so people will optimize for that. When we're looking at doing, I think, these for security cases, there's some conversations that need to happen about how you can get access to more information. It is very possible with OpenTelemetry to have, essentially the model is your sources go into a collector and then it goes to the back end. You can have multiple backends. So you could easily say, this is a security backend, send like all the logs down there and we'll store them for our stuff, where the operational purposes it goes to a different place, depending on your needs. And you can process them before you send them as well. So there's quite a lot of flexibility, but that is a conversation that needs to happen. The other thing is, at the moment, the idea of using OpenTelemetry for security cases is very new, to the point where there's not a lot of the information we might want to have. For example, a lot of the information that would come out of traces is not in place. There is an OpenPR in the OpenTelemetry website to add a lot of security context information into the open tracing libraries, into their semantic conventions. So all the different things we would need to get out of security people. That's not there yet, but I think it could be in the future. There's no reason why it can't be added, so I see it as something that's potential for the future. But right now, not all there yet. So in conclusion, what was I trying to do with this talk? What have I hopefully done? If there's one takeaway from this talk, it's if you're in security, go and talk to your observability teams and find out what they're doing. Are they already instrumenting with OpenTelemetry? If they are instrumenting with OpenTelemetry, what information can you get out of there? What feeds can you take? How can you leverage this? Because I think there's a real opportunity here for us to essentially improve security and improve the way that we work with the teams that we work with. Because at the moment, I think we're in the position where there's too much information coming, and I think it's hard for us to keep up. And I think that this has the opportunity potentially to improve that. So I hope that was interesting as an idea. I said this isn't a talk where I'm kind of going to walk up here and say, I have all the answers and it's this and you just do that. This is far more, I think this is something which is on the rise, something that security teams should be aware of. And I think there's an opportunity for security here to be in the conversation around how observability tooling develops and to try and guide it into use cases that work for us. I'd be very interested, because this is just an idea-based talk, if anyone hates the idea, fine, I'm very happy to hear why. Anyone likes the idea, also very happy to hear why. Anyone says, oh, I'm already doing this, I've been doing this for ages, very happy to hear that, because I couldn't find a lot of information where people are already doing this. There's like the odd talk or two, but it's not something I think that's heavy use. So there are all the various, I used to have one thing, I put one social link up here, now I have to put loads. There are all the various social links and email obviously as well. If anyone's got any questions about that, happy to have the questions now or on socials later, or I'll be around at the conference for the rest of the day as well.